The night had the weight of old ghosts in it, the kind that drifted through smoke-filled rooms and lingered in the lone notes of a jazz band playing a little too late, a little too slow. Hollywood in those years wore its glamour like a polished mask, but beneath it lived a quieter truth. Power moved in whispers, favors were remembered longer than sins, and a joke could be a weapon sharper than a blade. Dean Martin understood that world well. He had learned early that dignity, when worn effortlessly, unsettled men who relied on fear and noise. And on this night, as he stepped into a private supper club just off Sunset, that quiet understanding would be tested in a way no stage or studio ever had. Dean entered without ceremony, dressed simply, his posture relaxed, his expression warm but unreadable. To the untrained eye, he was just another star passing through a room that existed to impress him. To those who knew better, he was something else entirely, an anchor of calm in an industry built on excess, a man who carried grief and loyalty as privately as others carried pistols. The room noticed him immediately, not because he demanded attention, but because he never asked for it. Conversations softened, laughter shifted pitch, and even the waiters moved with a touch more care as he took his seat at a long table reserved for men who believed the world bent when they leaned on it. At the head of that table sat a mob boss whose name was spoken carefully and rarely in daylight. He was a man who thrived on intimidation dressed up as charm, whose smile came too quickly and whose eyes never joined it. Tonight, he was in a generous mood, surrounded by hangers-on and deal-makers, basking in the pleasure of an audience that laughed when he laughed and leaned in when he spoke. Dean was invited not as a subordinate, but as a symbol, a famous face that validated the boss's sense of importance. Dean accepted the invitation for reasons he never explained, perhaps because he understood that sometimes presence itself could be a form of quiet control. The dinner unfolded with practiced ease. Wine flowed, stories grew broader, and the boss dominated the table with anecdotes meant to remind everyone who held the invisible reins. Dean listened more than he spoke, nodding politely, offering a gentle smile when appropriate, never competing for the spotlight. Those who watched him closely noticed something else. His composure never cracked, but it was not passive. It was deliberate, the stillness of a man who had already decided who he was and would not be moved from that place. As the evening wore on, the boss's humor grew sharper, his jokes drifting toward cruelty disguised as wit. He mocked rivals, belittled absent men, and tested the room's appetite for discomfort. Each time, the laughter came a second too late, forced and brittle. The boss noticed, and like all men who fear losing control, he pushed harder. His gaze settled on Dean with a calculating glint, sensing in him both status and restraint. An irresistible target for someone who enjoyed crossing lines simply to prove he could. He began lightly enough, teasing Dean about his smooth voice, his easy charm, the way America seemed to forgive him anything. The table laughed, relieved that the spotlight had not burned anyone too deeply. Dean responded with a soft chuckle, his eyes kind, his tone respectful. He did not rise to the bait, and that refusal, subtle as it was, unsettled the boss more than any insult could have. Power, after all, feeds on reaction. Then came the moment that would change the room forever. With a casual wave of his hand, as if brushing aside a crumb, the boss made a joke about Dean's dead brother. It was delivered with a grin, framed as dark humor, the kind of cruelty men like him called honesty. The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable, their meaning clear to everyone at the table. Laughter did not come this time. Instead, there was a sharp intake of breath, the sound of people realizing they had just witnessed something irreparable. Dean did not move. He did not flinch, did not raise his voice, did not harden his expression. For a long, suspended moment, he simply looked at the man across from him, his gaze steady, his face calm. Those who knew Dean well understood that his silence was not weakness. It was memory. It was the weight of a boyhood shared, of loss carried quietly through years of applause, of a promise he had made to himself never to cheapen grief by turning it into spectacle. The boss, mistaking silence for permission, began to chuckle at his own remark, glancing around as if daring someone to object. The room remained frozen, every man painfully aware that they were standing on the edge of something that could not be undone. Violence was expected in such circles, but Dean Martin was not a violent man, and that was precisely what made the moment unbearable. No one knew what he would do, only that whatever came next would matter. When Dean finally spoke, his voice was low and even, carrying effortlessly across the table without demanding attention. He addressed the boss by name, not loudly, not with venom, but with the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly where he stood. He said that jokes, like music, required timing and taste, and that some subjects were not jokes at all. He paused, letting the words settle, then added, gently but unmistakably, that his brother's name was not a tool for anyone else's amusement. There was no threat in his tone, no hint of retaliation, but the effect was devastating. The boss's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, and in that pause the room understood what had happened. Dean had not attacked him. He had exposed him. In a world where respect was currency, Dean had calmly demonstrated that the boss had just spent more than he could afford. The silence that followed was profound. Glasses remained untouched, forks hovered above plates, and even the band seemed to sense the shift, their music softening into a distant echo. The boss attempted to recover, offering a half-hearted laugh, but it rang hollow, stripped of its earlier confidence. For the first time that night, he was the one being observed rather than obeyed. Dean rose from his chair without haste, smoothing his jacket as he did so. He nodded politely to the table, his expression unchanged, and thanked the host for the evening. There was no drama in his departure, no slammed doors or raised voices. He simply left, carrying with him the dignity that no one in that room could claim to have given him. In the days that followed, the story spread quietly, passed from one closed door to another, growing in significance with each retelling. It was not remembered as a confrontation, but as a lesson. Men who prided themselves on fear began to understand that there were limits they could not cross without consequence, and that some power did not need to announce itself to be felt. For Dean, the moment marked a turning point, not in his career, but in the way he was seen beyond the stage lights. He became, in whispered conversations, a symbol of something rare, a man who could move through dangerous spaces without losing himself, who could confront cruelty without becoming cruel. The injustice had been clear, the wound personal, but his response restored something larger than his own dignity. It reminded everyone who heard the story that respect, once lost, is not easily reclaimed, and that sometimes the most shocking force in the room is calm, unwavering decency. This was only the beginning. The world around Dean Martin was shifting, old alliances fraying, new tensions rising, and the line between glamour and darkness growing thinner by the day. What happened in that supper club would echo forward, shaping encounters yet to come, testing his resolve in deeper ways. And as part one of this larger story closes, one truth stands firm in the quiet aftermath. Dean Martin did not need to raise his hand or his voice to change the course of a room. He needed only to stand exactly where he was and refuse to let anyone else decide the worth of what he loved in the weeks after that supper club incident. Dean Martin's name was no longer spoken casually in certain rooms. Conversations stopped when he entered. Invitations grew oddly specific, oddly careful. It was not hostility he felt, but something more dangerous: calculation. Men who once laughed loudly now measured their words. Power, when quietly challenged, does not forget. It waits. Dean understood this instinctively. He had grown up knowing the cost of words, the permanence of loss, and the value of restraint. His brother's memory was not something he carried publicly, but it had shaped him in ways fame never could. What the mob boss had mocked was not just a death, but a boundary. And boundaries, once drawn, invite pressure. The pressure came disguised as opportunity. A major charity gala was announced, one backed by studios, unions, and private donors, whose names never appeared on programs. It was the kind of event that blended respectability with shadow, where tuxedos softened reputations and generosity laundered egos. Dean was asked to headline the evening. Not perform, headline. His presence alone would legitimize the room. The invitation was cordial, flattering, and unmistakably intentional. Dean accepted. The gala took place in a grand ballroom downtown, all crystal chandeliers and polished marble, a place where history pretended to be elegant. As Dean arrived, he felt the familiar shift in atmosphere, that subtle tightening of attention. Cameras flashed, voices hushed, and smiles appeared, too polished, too practiced. He moved through it with ease, greeting staff by name, thanking musicians, never rushing, never lingering. Composure was his armor, and tonight he wore it lightly. Then he saw him. The mob boss stood near the stage, surrounded by men who looked important without looking happy. He watched Dean closely, his expression neutral, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested confidence rather than comfort. This was not coincidence. This was theater. As the evening progressed, speeches were made about unity, generosity, second chances. The irony was thick enough to taste. Dean listened patiently from his seat near the front, hands folded, eyes attentive. When his turn came to speak, the applause was immediate and sincere. He rose slowly, the room leaning forward without realizing it. He did not begin with jokes. Dean spoke about responsibility, about the strange privilege of being heard, and the obligation that came with it. He spoke about families, about loss that never leaves you but teaches you how to stand. His voice was steady, unadorned, free of performance. The room grew quiet, not because he demanded silence, but because he offered something real. Then, without naming names, he addressed cruelty. He spoke of how power often mistakes volume for strength, how mockery is the refuge of those afraid to be seen clearly. He spoke of respect, not as fear, but as restraint, the choice not to wound simply because one can. Every word landed gently, and every word cut precisely. Those who understood glanced toward the mob boss. Those who didn't felt something shift anyway. When Dean finished, the applause was thunderous. Not polite, not strategic, genuine. That was the turning point. Later that night, backstage, the mob boss approached him alone. No entourage, no esmail. Just two men standing under the hum of fluorescent lights, far from the chandeliers. The boss spoke first, his tone controlled, almost respectful. He suggested that perhaps they had gotten off on the wrong foot, that jokes sometimes went too far, that misunderstandings happened. Dean listened without interrupting. When the boss finished, Dean nodded once and said quietly that forgiveness was not something he discussed in hallways. He added, just as calmly, that respect was not negotiated, it was demonstrated. Then he thanked the man for coming and turned back to greet a stagehand waiting nervously nearby. That was it. No threats, no deals, no reconciliation. But the message was unmistakable. In the months that followed, doors that once opened for the mob boss began to close just enough to matter. His influence did not vanish, but it dulled. Meanwhile, Dean's reputation deepened. He was no longer just admired. He was trusted. Younger performers sought his counsel. Studio heads listened more carefully when he spoke. He had become something rare in that era, a moral constant in an industry built on fluctuation. Yet the story was not finished. Because power does not retreat quietly, and dignity, once proven, invites its final test. As part 2 draws to a close, the stakes are higher than ever. Dean Martin has shown that calm can dismantle cruelty, that words chosen with care can outweigh threats spoken loudly. But the world around him is tightening, and those who feel exposed often strike hardest when they believe no one is watching. What comes next will not be about reputation or pride. It will be about legacy, and whether quiet strength can endure when the cost of silence becomes too high. By the time autumn settled over Los Angeles, the industry had begun to realign itself around an unspoken truth. Dean Martin was no longer just a beloved star. He was a measure. People watched how he reacted, how he chose silence over spectacle, how he refused to be pulled into the undertow of other men's insecurities. And for those who had built their influence on intimidation and leverage, that kind of moral gravity was intolerable. Calm could be ignored once, dignity twice, but authority without force, authority that others recognized freely, was a threat. The retaliation did not come loudly. It came subtly, the way serious men always move. A television special Dean had been verbally assured of stalled without explanation. A recording session was postponed indefinitely. A columnist who had praised him for years suddenly wrote a thinly veiled piece about stars who confuse moral sermons with entertainment. None of it was overt enough to challenge, but taken together, it formed a pattern. Someone was leaning on the machinery behind the curtain. Dean noticed. He always did. But he did not complain, did not call favors, did not attempt to defend himself in print. He continued working, continued showing up early, continued treating crew members and assistants with the same warmth and attention he always had. To those close to him, that was the most unsettling part. He behaved as though none of it mattered, as though he were waiting. The waiting ended with a phone call. A network executive, one Dean trusted, asked him to come by late one evening after the offices had emptied. The tone was careful, not fearful, but strained. When Dean arrived, he found a man older than he remembered, shoulders slumped under a weight that had nothing to do with ratings. Over a drink that neither of them finished, the executive spoke plainly. There was pressure coming from outside the network, pressure tied to money and distribution, pressure that came with names no one put on paper. Dean's continued visibility, his refusal to play along, had become inconvenient. "They want you quiet," the executive said finally. "Not gone, just smaller." Dean absorbed the words without reaction. After a moment, he asked a single question, his voice even. "And if I don't?" The executive hesitated. "Then they'll try to make an example of you. Not violently, respectably. They'll remind people who decides what gets seen." Dean nodded, stood, and thanked him for his honesty. There was no bitterness in his expression, only resolve. As he walked out into the cool night air, he felt the familiar ache of memory, the reminder that loss, once survived, stripped fear of its sharpest edge. He had already lost what mattered most. Everything else was noise. The example came sooner than expected. At a prestigious industry luncheon weeks later, Dean was seated prominently, his presence announced with practiced enthusiasm. The mob boss was there too, seated across the room, watching. Midway through the event, as awards were handed out and speeches droned on, a presenter took the stage and made an offhand remark about certain entertainers who mistake moral lectures for talent. The laughter that followed was scattered, uncertain. Cameras panned instinctively toward Dean. This time, the humiliation was public. Dean did not smile. He did not bristle. He simply waited. When his name was called moments later for a Lifetime Recognition Award, he rose slowly and walked to the podium. The room was electric with anticipation. This was the moment everyone expected a response, a rebuke, a headline. Men leaned forward, pens poised, certain they were about to witness a confrontation dressed as grace. Dean placed his hands on the podium and looked out at the audience, taking his time. When he spoke, his voice was calm, resonant, unmistakably steady. He thanked the organization, thanked the musicians, thanked the people who had worked beside him long before his name meant anything. Then he paused, and the room leaned into the silence. He said that he had learned something important over the years, that real influence was never proven by how loudly one could diminish others, but by how carefully one chose not to. He said that respect could not be demanded, mocked into submission, or enforced through pressure. It could only be earned, and it could be lost in a single careless moment. He did not look at the mob boss. He did not look at the presenter. He looked straight ahead and added one final sentence, delivered without emphasis, without threat. And the people who remember that are the ones who last. The effect was immediate and devastating. The applause did not erupt. It rolled in slowly, deliberately, growing heavier with each passing second until it filled the room completely. Some clapped because they understood. Some because they felt exposed. A few because they were relieved that someone had finally said what everyone had been afraid to articulate. The mob boss did not clap at all. He sat motionless, his expression rigid, aware that the balance had shifted again, and this time, publicly. From that day forward, the quiet campaign against Dean began to unravel. Studios hesitated to be seen as instruments of someone else's vendetta. Networks reconsidered. Public opinion, once nudged, had snapped back with force. The man who had been marked as inconvenient was now untouchable, not because he was protected, but because he was respected. Dean never acknowledged the victory. He returned to his work, his routines, his friendships, unchanged. But those who watched closely understood what had happened. In a world that thrived on leverage and fear, he had refused both. He had allowed injustice to reveal itself fully, then dismantled it with patience and clarity. As Part 3 closes, the danger has not vanished. It has merely retreated. The men who tested him have learned something they will never admit aloud. That true authority does not announce itself, does not threaten, does not rush. It waits, and when it speaks, it leaves no room for argument. What lies ahead will demand even more restraint, even greater resolve. Because the final challenge will not come from enemies alone, but from the cost of always being the calmest man in the room. By now, Dean Martin's calm had become legend, and legends have a way of attracting both reverence and resentment. The industry spoke of him in lowered voices, not because he demanded it, but because people sensed that something immovable stood behind his courtesy. Yet the price of being the calmest man in the room is that everyone assumes you can carry more weight than others. And so, quietly, relentlessly, the burden shifted toward him. It came disguised as responsibility. A young singer, barely known, immensely talented, and visibly terrified, was brought to Dean late one night after a show in Las Vegas. The boy had offended the wrong people, not through arrogance, but through refusal. He had declined to perform at a private gathering hosted by the same mob-connected circle that had tried, unsuccessfully, to humble Dean. The refusal was polite, but politeness did not protect those without standing. The message was clear: comply or disappear quietly from the industry. Dean listened as the boy spoke, his voice shaking, his hands clenched. There was no melodrama in the story, only fear. Not fear of violence, fear of erasure, of never being hired again, of being labeled difficult, of watching a future dissolve without explanation. Dean recognized that fear instantly. He had felt its shadow many years earlier, before the applause drowned it out. This was different now. This was no longer about him. Dean did not offer reassurance immediately. He asked questions gently, carefully, making sure the boy felt seen rather than rescued. When the story was finished, Dean sat in silence for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he said that talent deserved protection, but protection came with patience. He told the boy to do nothing, say nothing, and let him handle the rest. The rest would not be easy. Within days, word reached the same mob boss that Dean Martin was once again standing in the way. This time, however, it was not personal pride that had been wounded. It was authority. Dean was interfering, quietly dismantling a system that relied on fear of consequence. The boss understood something now that he had not before. Dean was not reacting. He was acting. A meeting was arranged. Neutral ground. No press. No witnesses who mattered. The setting was a private lounge overlooking the desert, its vast stillness a reminder of how small men really were. Dean arrived alone, as always. The boss arrived with two men who stayed just far enough away to be decorative. They spoke plainly. The boss accused Dean of overstepping, of confusing celebrity with influence. He reminded Dean of how the industry worked, of how easily careers could be stalled, how quietly names could vanish from lists. His voice was calm, but there was irritation beneath it now, the sound of someone accustomed to obedience. Dean listened without interruption. When the boss finished, Dean responded with a tone so measured it almost felt gentle. He said that he understood how the world worked, perhaps better than the boss assumed. He said that leverage and fear had their place, but they were fragile tools. They worked only as long as everyone agreed to be afraid. Then he paused, and in that pause the desert seemed to lean in. Dean said that he would not argue, threaten, or expose anyone. He would simply continue doing what he had always done: show up, work honestly, and refuse to participate in humiliation. He added, quietly, that every attempt to punish someone for integrity only made integrity more visible. And visibility, once achieved, could not be taken back. The boss scoffed, masking unease with dismissal. But something had shifted again. He was no longer speaking to a man defending himself. He was speaking to someone defending a line. The real turning point came weeks later, in a way no one predicted. The young singer was invited, unexpectedly, officially, to perform on a nationally televised special. No explanation was given, no apologies offered, but everyone understood. The networks had chosen safety in numbers, respect over pressure. Dean's quiet insistence had forced their hand without ever touching it. On the night of the broadcast, Dean watched from backstage, standing in the shadows as the boy took the stage, his voice steady now, his fear transformed into focus. The performance was flawless. When the applause came, it was overwhelming. Dean did not smile. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, as if acknowledging something older than triumph. The mob boss watched too, somewhere else, surrounded by screens instead of men. He understood now what he had miscalculated from the beginning. Dean Martin did not seek power, and because of that, power could not touch him in the usual way. Every attempt to corner him only widened the space around him. As Part 4 draws to a close, the stakes have shifted irreversibly. This is no longer a story about insult or retaliation. It is about legacy, about what happens when one man refuses to let cruelty become normal, when calm becomes contagious, when dignity spreads quietly from one person to another. But the cost is rising, because the more people Dean protects, the more visible his line becomes. And somewhere beyond the lights and the applause, men who have lost their hold on fear are deciding how much they are willing to lose before they strike back. Not with noise, but with permanence. Part 5 will not ask whether Dean Martin can remain calm. It will ask what calm demands in return. Be why now. Dean Martin understood the pattern. Every time dignity won, the cost increased. Every line he quietly drew forced the men who thrived on intimidation to either retreat or escalate in subtler, more permanent ways. And escalation, when it finally came, never announced itself. It arrived disguised as inevitability. The first sign was not professional. It was personal. One evening, after a late rehearsal, Dean returned to his home to find a single object placed carefully on the front step. No note, no mark, just something unmistakably meaningful, something only a few people knew the weight of. It was an item tied to his brother's memory, something long thought lost. Whoever left it there wanted him to understand one thing clearly. They still remembered. They still watched. Dean stood there for a long time, the house lights casting long shadows across the driveway. He felt the old ache rise again, sharp but familiar. Fear flickered at the edges, not for himself, but for what memory could be twisted into leverage. And then, as it always did, the fear passed. What remained was resolve. The next morning, word reached him through indirect channels that a major studio partnership was being reconsidered. Not canceled, reconsidered. The language of men who wanted him uncertain, who hoped hesitation would do what intimidation had failed to accomplish. Friends urged him to step back, to let things cool, to protect what he had already earned. They spoke out of care, not cowardice. Dean listened. Then he declined. What no one else knew was that Dean had already made his decision long before. The return of that object had not weakened him. It had freed him. It reminded him that grief, once carried honestly, could not be used as a weapon. The men trying to corner him believed silence meant submission. They were wrong. Silence, in his hands, was preparation. The confrontation everyone feared did not happen in a dark room or behind closed doors. It happened in daylight, under cameras, where fear had nowhere to hide. Dean was scheduled to appear at a national press event celebrating the future of American entertainment. Studio heads, sponsors, broadcasters, all present. The mob-connected figures were there too, blended seamlessly into respectability. The plan, as far as they were concerned, was simple. Surround Dean with smiles, box him in with optics, and force him into neutrality. Make him choose comfort over principle in front of the entire industry. Dean arrived early. He greeted reporters warmly, joked lightly, disarmed expectations. When he took the stage, the applause was strong but cautious. Everyone sensed that something unspoken hovered in the air, a question waiting to be answered. Dean did not begin with his career. He began with gratitude, for opportunity, for collaboration, for the strange privilege of being heard. Then, slowly he shifted. He spoke about how industries grow not through silence, but through courage. About how the future belonged not to those who controlled rooms, but to those who made room for others. His words were careful, precise, impossible to misinterpret. Then came the turning point. Dean spoke about loss, not abstractly, personally. He spoke of how grief teaches clarity, how it strips away illusions of control. He said that anyone who believed pain could be used to command obedience misunderstood both pain and power. He did not accuse. He did not name names. He simply stated a truth that could no longer be ignored. The room changed. Executives shifted in their seats. Cameras adjusted. The men who had relied on quiet pressure felt it slipping through their fingers. Dean had done what they feared most. He had moved the conflict into the open without turning it into spectacle. He had made dignity visible and intimidation irrelevant. When he finished, there was no immediate applause. There was something deeper, recognition. And then the clapping began, spreading unevenly at first, then with conviction. Not everyone joined. That absence spoke louder than any jeer ever could. Afterward, deals resumed. Projects moved forward, but something fundamental had altered. The men who once whispered about controlling outcomes now found themselves excluded from conversations that mattered. Not punished, simply unnecessary. Dean returned home that night and placed the recovered memento where it belonged, not hidden away, but honored. He sat quietly, reflecting not on victory, but on cost. He knew now that calm demanded sacrifice, comfort, ease, the luxury of disengagement. But it also offered something rare, the chance to leave a space better than he found it. As Part 5 closes, the danger has not vanished completely. It never does, but the balance has shifted decisively. Dean Martin has chosen a legacy that cannot be bargained with, a calm so grounded that even those who resent it must acknowledge its permanence. What comes next will not test his courage. It will test whether the world he has quietly reshaped is ready to stand without him stepping forward first.